Now I want to hand it over to the fascinating judge, Professor Nixon Sifuna, who's going to take us through the next session, a deep dive into two of the most pertinent issues pertaining to climate and security affecting our continent, and that's climate migration and our green energy transition. A better round of applause for Judge.
My name is Professor Nixon Sifuna. I'm a professor of environmental law and also a judge of the High Court of Kenya. I serve in the Commercial and Tax Court and the Anti-Corruption Court. So basically in terms of judicial work, I'm involved in all manner of cases, including criminal cases and all those, and commercial and tax disputes, as well as anti-corruption efforts. But above all, my background is environmental law. I'm a professor of environmental and natural resources. I hold a Bachelor of Laws degree from the University of Nairobi, a Master of Philosophy in Environmental Studies, majoring in environmental law, and a Doctor of Philosophy in Environmental and Natural Resources from the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. Well, thank you very much. I've been asked to moderate the next session. I have two speakers. I hope they're in. I have the pleasure of introducing your first speaker in this session, Otilia Ann Maungamita, head of, is that how it, yes, thank you. It's a hard name. How do you pronounce the second name, the surname?
Maungarize.
Maungarize. Yes, Maungarize, head of special projects, office of the executive director, Institute of Security Studies. Thank you. She will speak on Africa's green future, the geopolitics of energy transition. As you know, geopolitics the word geopolitics refers to politics influenced by geographical factors. Yes, and so she will also connect that with the energy transition, transitioning from hydrocarbon energy to clean energy. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Judge and Professor Sifuna. This conference is happening at a time when the EU's new carbon border tax kickoff is just months away. And at the same time, as we are speaking, a number of African representatives are in Victoria Falls for the Africa Voluntary Carbon Credits Market Forum. And I would say, we imagine ourselves almost collectively walking on a tightrope. Sounds a little bit difficult when I look around the room of over 100 people. But somehow, between the conversations that Africa is having and those that Europe are having, and conversations like this, where you have people from both continents represented in the room, we somehow have to strike a balance. I want to thank Kwesi for doing, or for saying some of what I was going to say, which helps me in many regards. But also to thank all the speakers before, because they make my job extremely easy. And of course, to Adelphi, to the governments both of Kenya and Germany for convening this important conference. So, whether we like it or not, Africa's green future is a hot topic. But I think when we speak about the future, we almost distance it from our present. Everything we've heard today tells us that we can't wait for tomorrow to speak about the green future. We actually have to be working on it today. The very real realities that colleagues have spoken about since this morning tell us that while someone, whether in Nairobi, in Abidjan, in Pretoria, in Addis Ababa, in Tunis, living in an urban setting, may have a different understanding and idea of what it means to have energy and what it means to have regular access to energy. I come from a country currently where load shedding is the only way that everyone can have some access to electricity, even if it's not 24 hours of the day, 7 days of the week, or 365 and a quarter days of the year. We are forced to balance what little resources we have to be able to give the majority of people access to electricity. But I also come from a country where, at least by way of urban development, is ahead of a number of other countries on the African continent. So the conversations of energy in South Africa will be different to the conversations on energy in Niger. But the conversation on development is the same. Fundamentally, whether you are in Niamey or in Pretoria, in Agadez or in Matatiele, it is important to recognize that our future is one in which development is the key ingredient. The three main issues that I'm going to cover are, of course, the green energy transition with this context in mind, then the positive potential, but also the spoilers of this green energy transition, and finally then, what does this mean for how we engage with the rest of the world, but also internally? It would be remiss of me to speak this afternoon without recognizing the many crises on the continent in which resources are a fundamental driver of those tensions. Whether it's a limitation to the access of resources, whether it's the discovery of new resources and the need for people to have them, whether it's in both Sudans, Sudan, Khartoum, South Sudan, Juba, whether it's in Ethiopia at the moment, what we are seeing in the north of Mozambique and Cabo Delgado, or in the Sahel, we have to be mindful of the tensions that exist. And we also have to be mindful of what people want, what people need, and what we're able to provide. There's been a lot of talk about Africa being able to leapfrog into a sustainable, secure energy future. However, and I have to repeat this, across the continent, there are reasonable grievances around how do we do that in the face of climate injustice, inequity, and perhaps what is termed in some parts of the continent as energy imperialism. Africa, of course, and again, Kwesi, thank you, you can invoice me later, has contributed the least in terms of waste as well as carbon emissions. Of course, it faces the gravest impact, whether it is the increase of cyclonic activity in the region where I'm from, in Southern Africa, where over the past 5 years, we have seen the number of cyclones that we had seen over 50 years prior. It is no joke that over 400 people died in eThekwini. It is no joke that Cyclone Freddy devastated Malawi, Mozambique, the island nations of Madagascar, as well as Mauritius. It is no joke for African people that happens at a time when we're also having conversations around how do we transition better. For a person who's never had access to electricity and energy, they may be wondering, what are we transitioning from and to where? Forget whether they know what carbon means in their local language. They would be curious to know, how do you move from what you currently have, which may be very little, to this green energy future, and are they the ones that are going to benefit from that? We have seen shifting weather patterns in the Sahel. In a country like Niger, where flooding has occurred before, but over the past 3 years has occurred annually. or pestilence in the Horn. And these are regions also that are calling for Africa to come to the table, not as an agenda item, so I'm very happy that the Berlin Climate Security Conference is happening in Africa. We're talking about Africa as Africans on the African continent. We're not just an agenda item, but we're also discussants in this conversation. And regardless, reality as it is reality. We cannot ignore the impacts. We cannot ignore the imperative for sustainable development. So as I begin to wrap up, colleagues, we need to reflect on who will benefit from a green, just, and I have to stress just. If you forget everything I say today, remember that when I spoke about the energy transition, I spoke about it as a just energy transition, not just an energy transition. Work with my wordplay here. So for the energy transition in Africa, we have to recognize who could be some of the winners and some of the losers. Some of them may be familiar to you. On the winner side, whether it is the private sector, or whether it is governments that have already invested a lot in forms of green energy, where countries like Algeria, Egypt, Libya, and Morocco are already primed to export large amounts of green hydrogen to Europe, less to Africa. A conversation that brings us then to who the losers could be. Which countries would benefit more if there was cheaper, readier to use access to green energy across the African continent, who have struggled to date? Which countries have received the most investments to be able to transition justly? Or promises for investments? Whether it's South Africa, the Kingdom of Morocco, Egypt, Kenya, or Nigeria, who, let's be honest, are already better off countries. How then do we allow some sort of a balance between those that stand to benefit the most and those who are on the other side of the inequality scale? And what are the ways that this could entrench inequality, with a number of African countries already lagging behind, particularly on development? But these losers could be winners if we speak about acceleration and better approaches, financed approaches to dealing with these issues. So, what will the African energy transition mean for geopolitical relations? We're already seeing a number of the shifts, and I've alluded to them. Some of these also include the rethinking of the global financial system. I was glad to hear earlier today a conversation around how do we reimagine the Bretton Woods institutions. But it also means reforming critical structures within and off the United Nations and relooking regional security architecture. If climate teaches us anything, it's that it won't constrain itself to IGAD, because IGAD member states have said we are IGAD. There can be spillovers into other regions which call for different kinds of collaboration internally, but also partnerships with our neighbors to the north, such as Europe. It also calls on us to wear a climate lens in the way in which we look at existing conflicts, and also ways in which we can look at that development, whether it is in Ethiopia or Sudan. So then, how can Africa develop sustainably to address climate risk? Through enhancing people's economic capacities as well as promoting human security. First, almost goes without saying, but policies and strategies must be deliberate. Second, we do need to build resilience to climate shocks. This requires an acknowledgement that climate shocks are very real, they're here, whether or not we like it. Third, that we have to climate-proof our infrastructure. It cannot be that when Cyclone Freddy hit in Southern Africa, that we saw different kinds of impact depending on how much countries had climate-proofed their infrastructure. In Malawi, we saw Cyclone Freddy wreaking immense havoc, even as the number of people directly impacted were half of those in neighboring Mozambique. The deaths were almost 4 times of neighboring Mozambique. The question is what could have been done to climate-proof the infrastructure in Malawi that was done, in fact, in parts of Mozambique. The fourth is efficiently managing natural resources, particularly water. I don't know about you, but I certainly can't survive without it. And so, what is needed then for the just, I repeat, just energy transition in Africa, and how can we be able to use this to also shield ourselves from potential geopolitical tensions? A month ago, the United Nations released its report on achieving sustainable pathways. Through the Kigali communique on ensuring a just and equitable energy transition in Africa, states developed what would be their plan. And this in many ways aligns with the African Common Position on Energy Access and Just Transition. I cite these because it's not for me to reinvent the wheel. It's for us in this room to recognize that they are existing instruments, documents, discussions that have been had. Let's build on those rather than wreck them. What do these three have in common? They speak to achieving universal access to modern sustainable energy. They speak to powering economic development, industrialization, and job creation. And they speak to deploying clean technologies to decarbonize energy systems and to put Africa on track for a climate-friendly development. So to summarize, and I end, what's needed? We already know that we need better investment in global development, in equity, and cooperation. We need to be realistic in how we go about this. And realism also means if you say you're going to invest, invest. Show me the money. Kwesi, this invoice is going to be long. Show me the money. Technology and resource efficiency is key. Infrastructure development is key. And innovation should be at the heart of that. Ultimately, we're looking to having sustainable economies, sustainable development, sustainable systems of energy, land, and food. And if we do that, a conversation about the geopolitical impact of an energy transition will be less about conflict, and you would have been mindful that I only mentioned conflict in passing, because these conversations have to be more about building, about restoring, and about sustainable development than they are about the negatives. To end, the Institute for Security Studies, an organization that I've proudly worked for close to 15 years, is busy at the moment compiling a Road to COP28 report. A lot of what you've said today will be very useful in the final report that we produce. This report for us is important because last year, through our Road to COP27, we were able to engage with member states towards, at the very least, some kind of common understanding on key points. It's not that all 54 member states of the African Union that are also members of the UN, but 55 member states of the African Union have to agree on everything. But it is that at the very least that they can be able to coalesce around some key points towards the next COP and to agree on what are negotiables and what are non-negotiables for the African continent. Judge Sifuna, thank you.
Thank you very much. Please give her a round of applause. The worst thing that can happen to you as a moderator is when the speaker is speaking something that is so passionate and convincing to you. Most of the time, instead of moderating, you are tempted to listen in, right, and be carried along. Thank you, that is very, very good. But before, I thank you very much, Ms. Otila, for that very good and, of course, pragmatic and very well researched piece on energy transition, on energy transition for Africa. And I like that. You've really made everybody who presents on problems, mostly you see, you tend to focus on sub-Saharan Africa most of the time. It happens that Saharan African countries have one thing in common, a lot of problems. Most of them are based on the fact that their economies are predominantly based on natural resources, and especially the raw material-based economy. Maybe before we go there, I would like to pick your mind on one or two things that you have raised. Well, Kenya's second president, the late former president Daniel Moi, coined a term that I've seen is similar to what you've coined today, what he called garbage imperialism. By the way, that is a term that was coined here in Kenya. It's homemade. Yes. And it has a relationship to what you've said. What happened was that there was concern about transboundary movement of hazardous wastes. And especially that led to the adoption of the Basel Convention on the transboundary movement of hazardous wastes in 1989. Later on, Africa got concerned about the fact that that was okay, but Africa thought that the regime that was put in place by the Basel Convention was permissive. It was kind of allowing, and Africa said they were better off if that convention had banned movement into Africa of hazardous wastes. So President Moi, among others, said that that was garbage imperialism, allowing garbage to move from the west to the south, into Africa especially. And of course that led to the Bamako Convention of 1991. African countries now came together and came up with something with that convention that now restricted movement of hazardous wastes into Africa, but again now permitted movement within Africa as between African states, among African states. Now my question to you is this: do you think that this kind of imperialism that you talk about now, energy imperialism, that maybe it's high time that Africa, African countries, for instance, or probably even developing countries, came up with an instrument, or instruments, maybe regional or multilateral, that could restrict or address the fact of movement of hydrocarbon-based energy? You see, African countries get very excited when fuel is released, oil is released from Russia or wherever. They say now the number of barrels has been increased. So is it high time that there was an instrument to address those issues, and knowing that that is transboundary movement of potentially polluting energy, such that when we now have these are the consequences of what we have received? Is it high time that the originators of that particular commodity can now also help us in bearing the brunt of the resultant pollution to you?
Well, what a loaded question, and I wasn't prepared for a Q&A, but that would be in many ways a counterweight, I would say, even now to what will be rolled out starting in October around what is effectively a carbon border tax, at least from the EU side. And I think a lot of the analysis has made as though the imposition, so to speak, obviously it will have a potential loss of revenue for the African continent, but it is made as though in the long term that this is not actually beneficial to the way in which African industries can grow, can be developed, and can be sustainable. And I say this because, and I mentioned in introducing that our level of development across the continent varies. A country like South Africa, and I can use that because, I'm going to go home on Saturday, but a country like South Africa, for example, will, and when I spoke to energy imperialism, this related to a list of potential grievances that have been raised by a number of countries. South Africa is one of those. Now, South Africa, for our energy needs at the moment, relies almost exclusively on coal. Almost exclusively. That being said, we have not, and this is at a country level, which then ripples regionally, and it speaks to this instrument that you ask about, we have underexplored the immense potential that we have for better energy sources, particularly for communities at the moment that don't have energy at all. Now, a few months ago, there was at least a state visit to look into the potential for a region in South Africa, the Northern Cape, which is basically mostly desert, and for which solar energy generation would be the easiest approach to take. What that does is, at first, if you start initiating your own processes internally, when you then go at a regional and continental level to negotiate an instrument that meets your needs, but that also addresses a key and fundamental issue around how much do we tax hydrocarbons or not, and how do we go about it? At the moment, let me be blunt, for a country like South Africa, it is going to be difficult to have that conversation with countries at the moment that are non-reliant or less reliant on carbon for energy generation. It will be an easier conversation for those that are reliant a lot on hydro electricity, for example. So it's always difficult to negotiate a common instrument, particularly in this regard. But the first step, and I'll end there, is to look inwards and to explore what options are there for us to be in a better position than we currently are, and then to use that collectively as a shield against the potential impact that it has. And I have to stress this, we remain, for better, for worse, unfortunately, we remain the continent that is facing the gravest impact. So we can politic all we want, but we cannot ignore that impact. And then, whatever shifts we make internally, then we can be able to project sub-regionally and to the continent.
Thank you. I would like to have a reaction, at least I've been reminded that we don't have time. I would like to have at least one reaction from the common space, so that the presenter can react to it. Just to demonstrate that you are following her presentation, isn't it? Yes. Yes. Anybody who was not awake? Yeah. Anybody who wasn't awake? Well, anyone who was awake. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Musla Abdullahi. I'm a climate security analyst from Nigeria. You mentioned something about just transition. Is just transition about having access to more finance for climate and renewable projects, or is it about being able to harness like Nigeria's gas reserves? Nigeria is having a lot of conversation about why we need to process our own gas to be able to reach that economic development that makes transition easy. Is that transition? And for us, for a country of over 200 million people, high energy needs, and lots of energy poverty, it's a security issue for us in terms of the energy transition. We have a plan that looks at 2060, but we don't have the money for that. And so I want to hear more in terms of energy transition, just what it really means for us, for countries that really have a lot of gas reserves, and how do you make use of that? And lastly, what's the survival for us? And we depend a lot in terms of revenues from fossil fuels, and what happens when the world moves away from that? How do we survive? How do we look after 200 million people?
Thank you very much for that, and I'm really glad that the question came from someone from Nigeria, because a lot of again, a lot of the dynamics that I speak of from the part of the continent that I'm from, but differently now in respect of, particularly in respect of oil, are very prominent for Nigeria. At the same time, and you know this better than I do, but at the same time, the access to electricity for the majority of Nigerians remains difficult, if not complicated is perhaps not the word for it. It took me a while when I was in Abuja for a couple of weeks to realize that during the whole time I was there that we were using electricity from a generator. Because it was consistent where I was staying, it took me a while to actually realize that we're not getting electricity from the grid. And that speaks then to the questions around inequity, around even pricing, so to speak. And I know this is perhaps a difficult conversation within the Nigerian context as well, but the opportunities even there for sustainable energy, particularly for the masses, right? Because at the moment, and I have to stress this, particularly in urban spaces, even those that are relying on fossil fuels for electricity, the numbers are unfortunately dwindling, right? So an alternative has to be in place regardless. And there are communities for which this energy poverty, if I can call it that way, has had many ripple effects. It's for someone from Southern Africa, it's a bit difficult because I'm speaking to a Nigerian, but I mean, when you look at the dynamics, particularly in the Niger Delta, the conflict and the context within the Niger Delta speaks to what happens when you have so much, but the people have so little. The dynamics that we're seeing spreading out of Nigeria within neighboring countries, including Niger, including Chad, for example, speak to this. So you can have innumerous resources. It does not mean that the people have those resources. What does just mean? Just means moving towards both the transition itself, but reaching equity within that process. It cannot be that the beneficiaries of a just energy transition are the same people right now that still have access to carbon-based energy. It has to be in a way that allows the over 200 million Nigerians to also have access to that electricity. So exploring options, being pragmatic about it, but also facing up to the fact that if nothing is done, the kinds of tensions that we're seeing in different parts of the country will not go away, unfortunately, because people are tired.
Thank you very much. And maybe to wrap it up, I would say this, that one lesson that we've learned today is that energy is one of the major contributors of climate change. Our energy sources and how we use them. So it's a primary concern. And I would add that the atmosphere is, of course, a global common. It's like that what happens anywhere in the atmosphere should be a concern of each one of us. And the duty, to whom much is given, much is expected. So there's a challenge now to the West. They have more resources, and we expect them to spend more resources to protect this environment that we are sharing. Thank you very much.